Oh, hello. I want to talk about what it was like going to the movie theater in the 90s. That was peak movie going back then. You know, I grew up in the 90s. I used to go to the movies religiously with my dad. We'd go what felt like multiple times a month, but at least one time a month. It's a totally different experience back then than it is now. You know, I remember newspapers were a big part of the movie-going experience. If you wanted to know what movies were playing at your local theater, you'd go to the newspaper and you'd have a whole section and it'd have movie posters and it would have show times and you'd see what's playing at your movie theater and you'd get to plan around that, which was pretty cool. Other than that, you'd call your movie theater on your old landline and it would take you to a menu on the phone and it would give you different numbers. 1 is Mission Impossible. Number 2, Beauty and the Beast. Number 3, and so on and so forth, right? You would click on the number of the movie you want to see and it would give you all the show times and you'd have to write down the different show times that you want to go with your friends or your family, and that's how you would plan a theater trip. That was so crazy because that's such a dead way of doing it. No one does that anymore. I don't even think they have that option for you because you just go online and you look at the show times there, which admittedly is way easier. There were 2 movie theaters in my town. Our favorite was the Beverly Cinema in Champaign, Illinois, but a close second was the Savoy 16. One thing I remember is you walk into the theater, you buy your movie ticket, and then you go directly to the concession stand where we would get popcorn and slushies or a Coke. I mean, you had to get a popcorn and a Coke at least. But for a slushie, I would get I think it was the cherry flavor, or what was that, blue raspberry for the slushie. You should mix the Coke with one of the cherry or raspberry flavors, and that makes an amazing drink. My 2 favorite candies, my 2 mainstays at least, were Sour Patch Kids and Reese's Pieces. I would alternate between those 2 if I got candy at all. There was this little section next to the concession stand where there was this lineup of different seasonings you could put on the popcorn. I believe my favorite was white cheddar, and I also used ranch a lot, and I would smother my popcorn in that stuff. And I would eat it like a Tasmanian devil while watching the movie. And many times I would end up getting sick, but I didn't care. I loved it. I loved it at the time. Although one time my dad took me to this movie, Star Trek Generations, and I had eaten it way too fast. I got really nauseous during an action scene and he had to take me to the bathroom. Once I was done with that, I felt much better and I could enjoy the movie. But going to the movies back in the day was so much fun. I remember they had pamphlets at the entrance of the door. The whole pamphlet would have different movies that were coming out soon. They'd have the title, the date it was supposed to come out, what it was going to be rated, and it would give a little synopsis of what it was about. And I remember loving that. Like, before the movie trailers would come on, I would just read through it and get excited about what was coming. I mean, this is before we would use the internet for everything, you know? The internet really didn't get more sophisticated until like the early 2000s. At least that was my experience of it. And everything was so much more manual back then. I don't know if anyone else out there remembers that. Do you remember getting the pamphlets where it'd show those coming attractions? Anyway, I remember the cardboard cutouts for these epic movies that were going to come out. Like, let's think of like Titanic. I remember they had this big cardboard cutout display with the Titanic jutting out at us and Leo and Kate Winslet up there. And I remember thinking, wow, that's epic. I remember this one cardboard display for Deep Impact. It showed like the world and a meteor coming at it, and if I remember correctly, there were these digital numbers counting down to 0 to show you when the world was going to end, and I thought that was effective. I loved Deep Impact. Back in the day, there was all these movies that were carbon copies of each other, but released at the same time, like A Bug's Life and Ants. Deep Impact, Armageddon, Ed TV, and The Truman Show. Seeing movie trailers in a theater, it was a way bigger deal back then. Nowadays, if I go to a movie at all, the trailers I see, I've usually seen trailers for already on YouTube. I suspect that's everyone's experience now. Movie trailers, we're used to seeing them the instant they drop. But back then, you really had to wait till it would be on TV, or you would be introduced to these movies in the movie theater with surround sound and a great picture, and you'd get so hyped to see that movie. It was a huge deal.
One of my favorite memories of going to the movies was with Twister.
It was released in theaters in 1996, and I was about 8 years old, and my parents actually let me skip school to go see it. We went out to eat at a restaurant and then straight to the Savoy 16, and that movie blew me away, especially since it reminded me of my hometown and the tornadoes we would occasionally get there, all the cornfields in the movie, stuff like that. It just left a huge impression on me. That feeling of getting lost in the movie and feeling like I was a part of the movie, inside the movie. It's just hard to explain how into movies people would get back then, especially since moviegoing isn't as popular as it once was. The special effects of Twister was state of the art at the time, and I remember there being a sense of wonder with myself and the audience in terms of like how the filmmakers accomplished what we were watching on the screen. Nowadays we know how most effect shots are done. Usually we just chalk it up to CGI or even AI, and we can see any making of video we want on YouTube. But back then it felt like pure magic. There was also the fact that we knew movies wouldn't be on VHS for about 6 months or longer from the time they showed up in movie theaters. That was part of the mystique of catching a fresh movie in the theaters when they came out. 6 months is an eternity, especially when you're a kid like I was back then. It would go something like this. The movie would show up in theaters, then it would move to second run theaters where it costs $2 or less. Then it would end up on VHS. So you knew you had to go see the movie as soon as it came out on the best screen with the best sound you could, because if you didn't, it would be a long wait. The social behavior at a movie theater has changed a ton as well since back in the 90s. We didn't have problems with people looking at their phones because, well, cell phones were kind of new and were still just for calling people, if you can believe that. Now we can watch a movie on our phone while at the movie theater. You know, if the movie sucks, I might consider doing that, but we can check out social media or look up endless facts about the movie we're watching. We can and do text people while watching movies. I mean, there was always a chance someone would talk during a movie, which always sucked. But in general, it seemed like everyone was willing and ready to focus on the movie they were watching. That's what we were there for, you know? I remember car rides home being strictly about our viewing experience, what we liked about the movie, what we hated, theories about why a character did what they did, how did they do that special effect. That's another thing. We would always be like, how did they do that? It was a conversation that would last for days or weeks or, even longer. Gen Z seems to be uninterested in movies altogether these days. There was an article in The Wrap about how Gen Z prefers social media and live streaming over TV and movies. That may seem preposterous to anyone who grew up in the 90s, but it's not really hard to understand. The mystique of going to the movies and not knowing everything about how it's made or what it's about, those days seem to be all but gone. I'm not trying to be all doom and gloom. It's just how things change over time. And truthfully, there's just so many ways to consume content now that it was bound to happen, And there's still great movies that get released into theaters. Don't get me wrong. It just seems like the golden days of movie going has changed dramatically. Who else remembers the movie theater intros they would do right after the trailers, but right before the movie started? At my movie theater, there was a spaceship that took off and it was flying around like what looked like a celluloid, and it would fly past popcorn and candy, and then it would say the name of the theaters, in our case, Beverly Cinema. But I know that each theater has its own type of intro. The best I could find was this clip here. Now, I need you to sound off in the comments about this. Do you remember these intros? And if you do, what was the intro like at your theater? I fell out of love with going to the movies sometime around 2012 to 2015. It just felt like movies were getting a little less interesting to me. I loved the Marvel movies. I thought that was worth going to the theaters for. Iron Man, all the Avengers movies. Those were worthy of movie theaters. It just hasn't been the same recently, and I think that has a lot to do with Hollywood not caring as much and not really focusing on story as much, and maybe getting too hung up on the message, whatever that may be at the time for Hollywood. Get back to storytelling.